The place of my imprisonment was called NKVD Camp No. 240. It was not for German prisoners of war, but for state criminals. The camp was surrounded by 5 rows of barbed wire. At the corners were watchtowers with machine gunners. There were armed sentries every 50 meters and a guard dog every 100 meters. The camp held 15,000 prisoners from all walks of life. Some were formerly high-ranking officials, but mostly ordinary laborers were held here. Among the camp's inhabitants were about 800 women. The prisoners were mostly Russian civilians, convicted of collaborating with the enemy. Their guilt was that they had worked for German industrial firms. There were also military men here, officers who had been taken prisoner by German troops but then released to work for Germany. Here in the camp, they were used as informers. I arrived here on January 11, 1944. My escorts led me to a building at the entrance to the camp and handed my papers to one of the military men in the building. The convoy immediately forgot about my existence, going to warm up and chat with the camp guards. The man behind the big desk finished the formalities of admitting me to the camp very quickly, as if he had already done it 1,000 times, and I had no doubt that he had. He gestured to one of the soldiers that his work was done. The convoyman, he pointed to, seemed a little annoyed at being cut off from his conversation with the soldiers. He grabbed me roughly by the arm and led me to my future location. It was the barracks where the new arrivals were kept. There were 2 such barracks in the camp for new prisoners. It was ordered to keep us there for the quarantine period, so that we would not bring diseases and contagions into the camp. Organizationally, the place of our imprisonment consisted of companies, battalions, and groups. Each unit had a senior officer. I learned that I was assigned to the 6th Squad of the 2nd Platoon of the 5th Quarantine Company. The platoon commander met me at the door, then led me into the barracks. His unit was housed in 3 rooms. Each was only about 4 by 4 meters in size, but it housed 107 men. I stepped inside, and the sight of the horrible conditions made me freeze with horror. Behind me came the battalion commander, who closed the door behind me and read me the following rules in a mechanical voice. Order and discipline reign here. The signal to rise is at 5 o'clock. At 7 o'clock you get food. 1 portion is 1 liter of soup. At 8 o'clock the barracks must be cleaned. At 12 o'clock you get 600 grams of bread, 100 grams of fish, and 25 grams of sugar. At 4 o'clock again soup is given out, and at 6 o'clock it is time to go to bed. During the quarantine, the prisoners do not do any work. All you have to do is to stay in these barracks for the next 21 days and not cause any trouble. Do you understand? Without looking at him, I simply answered, yes. He turned and left me alone. I took a deep breath and headed for one of the rooms, trying my best to ignore the faces staring in my direction as I made my way through the multitude of bodies to find a vacant corner against the wall. When I reached the edge of the room, I collapsed to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. I was overcome with sad thoughts. The conditions here were unbearable. It was freezing outside, and the temperature was below freezing. Inside, the heat and the stale air could kill you. It was dark outside, and all I wanted to do was close my eyes and hide from everything that was happening to me. I sat on the floor without any thoughts in my head, as I was too exhausted to think. After 2 hours, the lights were turned off, and it was time for sleep, but we were stuffed in here so tightly together that it was simply impossible to sleep through the night with our legs stretched out. We practically slept on top of each other. I had someone else's leg on my back. Every time I leaned against the man behind me, he pushed me away. But I was too tired and depressed to pay attention. That night was the worst night of my life. The next morning, when the food was first brought in, I found that we had not even been given what had been promised. This was because the Russian commanders were fed the same food as the prisoners. They were served first, starting with the company commanders. The battalion commander took what he wanted and gave the rest to the senior men in the companies. Each of the seniors in the battalion received food for his entire battalion. They could all take whatever they wanted from it to fill their stomachs, and then the leftovers were distributed to the senior men in the units. When he chose his portion, everything went on the same way. Therefore, out of the promised 600 grams of bread, we received only about 400 grams. Out of 100 grams of fish, we got about 60 grams. There was no talk of 25 grams of sugar. Instead, we got about 10 grams. There was no point in complaining. When people gathered around the food distribution area, I took advantage of this to take a seat in the corner that had been vacated, where I could make myself comfortable so that I would not come into contact with anyone. At last, the distribution of bread reached me. I asked one of my companions in misfortune to bring me my soup. He gladly complied with this request, as he took advantage of it. When he returned, it was clearly evident that he had managed to snatch something for himself. There was only about half a liter of soup left for me. I turned my back to the barracks and ate my portion very slowly. I took the opportunity to focus on something and take my mind off the discomfort and the feeling of sadness that possessed me. But when the food was finished, I had no choice but to sink back into despair. Each of those miserable days, I tried my best to avoid contact with anyone. I realized that my barrack mates had a sense of curiosity about me because I rarely spoke. Escaping from the camp was impossible. On the fourth day, one of the guards passed me as I was sitting on the floor, and he liked my shoes. He ordered me to take off my shoes. Since I had no choice, I obediently gave it to the guard. He first lifted it up to examine it, and then took off his shoes one by one to try on the upgrade. Satisfied, he threw his old worn-out shoes in my face and walked away. I picked them up and eagerly pulled them on my feet, as if that was the way it was supposed to be. 2 days later, the temperature in the room began to drop. We had used up our allotted amount of coal for heating. As it was explained to us, it was our own fault that we had burned too much coal too quickly, and now we would have to wait for the next allotment. Of course, the camp staff lived in warmth. Some of the heat from their rooms reached through the corridor to the rooms where we were kept. The best place was the one by the door, which was the cause of several quarrels. I was content with my corner. I tried to squirm to get as small as possible, to keep my body heat in, but it was no use. The wall was as cold as ice. Even though my coat was warm, it didn't provide enough protection from the cold. Besides, there was nowhere to hide from the stench. I had hoped that someday I would get used to the foul odor of the room, but I never did. I suffered from indescribable hunger and unbearable cold. I had experienced many hardships in the war before, but they were nothing compared to the misfortunes that had befallen me here. Every day I felt weaker and lonelier. I was sure that my family, my friends, my battalion mates had long ago decided that I was dead. That was probably what was going to happen. I lasted 14 days, at the end of which I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had reached the extreme point of despair. I felt that I was left with only one choice as to what to do with my life. That decision alone gave me a sense of mental comfort that I hadn't felt in a long time. At least I had something to do, a goal to achieve instead of just living another miserable day. I began to prepare myself to fulfill that task. I found a spot in our room from which I could watch the guard barracks. I waited until all the guards had left the premises and none of them could see me. Then I quickly entered their barracks area and picked up the razor blade left by the sink. I will use it to slit my wrists. I hid the blade in the sleeve of my coat and walked back quietly. Then returned to my corner with the precious booty and sat down on the floor. I slowly took the blade out of my pocket, careful not to let anyone see what I was doing, and took a long look at it. I twirled the blade in my hands a few times. I felt more and more excited that my suffering would soon be over. I tried to turn my thoughts to those I loved, to those I had left behind, to my family and friends, but instead I couldn't stop thinking about the Russians I had met in the NKVD prison cell at the recruiting station. They met all adversity with such dignity. I admired them for that and felt ashamed that I could not behave in the same way. What is this weakness that exists in me that has not settled in their bodies? Instead of joyful excitement, I began to feel shame. After all, I had allowed myself to give in. Suddenly, mentally, I was back to digging into the rock-hard ground near Kharkov, preparing the trenches before we took that city. Any resistance can be overcome. That's what long training taught us. Didn't I work hard to overcome that resistance? Or did the opposite happen, and the Russians managed to overcome it within themselves? Just seconds ago, Everything had been clear in my mind, and I had made the decision to end my life. Now I was at a loss because I had lost that certainty. I kept twirling the blade in my hands as if studying it. I thought it would help me regain my lost sense. But literally in an instant, everything changed. Now, looking back, I believe it was a true miracle. I didn't realize that one of the prisoners was watching me. He realized what I was about to do. He quietly came out and called for the battalion commander. I continued to sit with my back to the barracks and study the blade, but after a few minutes I felt the presence of men standing very close to me. I slowly turned around and was horrified to find two men watching me intently. A tear slid down my face. The commander ordered me to stand up. I dropped the blade back into the sleeve of my coat and, complying with the command, struggled to my feet. "Who are you? What is your name?" the commander asked. His voice sounded polite but firm. "I'm a Pole. I don't know why I'm here. I shouldn't be here." My voice trembled. I was so weak and depressed that I could barely think. I weighed my every word and found myself making long pauses between sentences. I was an officer in the Polish army, and my only crime is that I wanted to go back there again. That's all. That's all I wanted to do. I just wanted to go back to the army, and instead they brought me here. I don't know what I did to deserve this. I tried my best to hold back the tears, but during this explanation, I just gave up trying. They had broken me, and I didn't care what this man thought of me. The commander hesitated for a moment. I could feel him looking at me, even though I didn't raise my gaze to him. I continued to stare at the floor. I waited for him to decide what to do with me, with this pathetic poor man he was now looking at. He took a deep breath and asked, "Are you getting your portion?" "Yes," I answered. "That's not true," replied the prisoner who had reported me, beginning to take part in the scene. I watched him. He is one of those who get nothing, but he is too modest, and so he doesn't tell anyone about it. I look up to see how the commander would react to this. Does he really care? I was actually sent here to die anyway. The commander looked me over from top to bottom, and I felt his reaction, which shouldn't have been there. I felt like he felt sorry for me. He looked back and sent for his subordinate, a lieutenant who was from Kiev. He entered the room, approached us, and reported to the commander that he had arrived. "Take this man to the bathhouse, wash him, and rid him of lice." The lieutenant led me out of the barracks, but the commander called him away again, giving new instructions. At this time, I stood near the door, leaning against the wall, and tried to calm myself. I did not hear the conversation, but I realized that the commander had ordered Anishchenko to give me some clothes. On the way to the bath, Anishchenko took a pair of officer's shoes from someone from the guard. He also found a pair of pants, a green German shirt, and a civilian fur coat, which was in good condition. It was a long black fur coat, similar to the one I had before, but in much better condition. The lieutenant handed it all to me. I didn't say anything, but looked at him and gave the man the sincerest smile to express my gratitude. As I realized, he was happy about it. I was so weak from hunger that I could hardly stand. Lieutenant Anishchenko supported me and helped me to dress in the bathhouse. When we began to take off my shabby clothes, a razor blade fell to the floor from my sleeve, breaking the silence. We both froze for a moment and looked down at the shiny object. As we did so, I felt shame. I tried to reach for it and quickly toss it aside, but as I reached out for the blade, I almost fell. Anishchenko quickly supported me with one hand and with the other, bending over, calmly picked up the blade. Standing up, he put the blade in his overcoat pocket, turned to me and said, "You won't need it anymore, unless, of course, you want to shave." He sensed that I was uncomfortable talking about what had happened, and we focused again on how to wash me. Even though our conversation was over, the lieutenant was gracious and patient. It took me a long time to wash and dress as I could not move quickly. The lieutenant showed no signs of impatience. Maybe he was glad to be doing something other than maintaining discipline and order. When I was finally ready, he took me back to the battalion commander, who greeted me with a friendly smile. "I've been going over your file, Oscar. It's all true, and you really were an officer in the Polish army." "Yes, Commander. All the documents you had on you weren't forged." "No, Commander. I told the truth about everything." The commander looked at Anishchenko, and he nodded affirmatively in response. Oscar, continued the commander, we believe that you were sent here rashly. We now have good relations with the Polish army. Unfortunately, I must admit that I cannot release you from the camp. I looked at the floor and replied, I understand, but I can help you. The war is now turning in our favor. The Germans are fleeing. As you know, we have lost many soldiers in the war, but more are needed to push the invaders back to Berlin and ensure our victory. We are sorely lacking guards in this camp. If you are indeed a former officer of the Polish army, I am ready to accept you as one of the staff in the 10th Company. I looked carefully at the commander in bewilderment. I quickly realized that I needed to immediately remove the expression of extreme shock from my face so as not to arouse suspicion that this decision of theirs was unacceptable to me. Still, I barely managed to contain my emotions. My voice trembled slightly as I quietly interjected. What? Lieutenant Anishchenko will bring you up to speed. Congratulations, Oscar. With these words, the commander rose and left the room. I also tried to stand up, but I could not do it fast enough, so when I stretched out, the commander had already disappeared from sight. Anishchenko supported me by the arm, helping me up. The officer took me to the company personnel room. There he introduced me to Lieutenant Nikolai Sherapil from Moscow, who served as adjutant in the regiment guarding the rebel supporters. I thought I would look pathetic in his eyes, but he was used to seeing people in my condition and paid no attention to the fact that his subordinate was barely dressed himself. I was assigned a place in the barracks and assigned to work in the company in carrying out orders from the battalion. I was even provided with uniforms. I was pretty exhausted after the overly eventful last few hours. Lieutenant Sherapil allowed me to rest in the barracks until dinner. I gladly obeyed. For the first time in many weeks, I could lie down with my legs and torso fully extended. The room was warm, for there was no shortage of coal for the stove, and I wrapped myself in my wonderful new coat. I was overwhelmed with a feeling of comfort. It was an unforgettable sensation. My stomach was still empty, but I was comforted by the thought that it would soon be full when I got my food. I was still shocked at how quickly my fate had changed. In just a few hours, I had gone from a prisoner starving and ready to part with my life to an officer serving in the Russian army. Imagine an officer in the ranks of the Russians. How did I manage to achieve this? I was proud of myself and smiling. In addition, I had to recognize the kindness shown by the Russians who captured me, my enemies. This was another piece of news to me that I had not expected. How strange, I thought aloud. A few hours later, I woke up after a short rest to get my dinner. It was the first time in many months that I was able to eat in a way that completely satisfied my hunger. My stomach wasn't used to copious food, so it took me a few days before I could eat normally again. Anishchenko let me go for the rest of the evening. I gratefully returned to my bunk, but I realized that I had a lot of work to do. Something had come out of this deception, but it was only the beginning. The danger was still not over. I would have to stay here in this place until the opportunity presented itself to actually go to the Polish army, and after that to the German army, or until some other circumstance arose that would allow me to really be safe. I wanted to get back on my feet and intended to try to earn their trust and favor. This became a new goal for me. It was very different from the one I had set for myself only a few hours before. The next morning, I woke up and dressed quickly. I was followed into my room by Anishchenko, who smiled when he saw me wearing my new uniform. It took a lot of effort on my part, but from the very first day, I carried out any order given to me accurately and on time. As the days went by, my rations increased and I became more like a human being. I also received 100 grams of tobacco every 10 days, the same amount as all Russian officers. Soon my strength began to return to me. 2 weeks after I accepted the battalion commander's offer, he promoted me to breeding officer. I must repeat again and again that I was very thankful that God had not abandoned me.